A photo from 1908 showed a mother and her three daughters sitting for a normal studio portrait. At first glance, everything looked calm and polite, but one detail changed the whole feeling. One daughter wasn't looking at the camera. Dr. Helen Morrison had been studying family photos from the Victorian and Edwardian eras for 2 decades. She thought she had seen everything, but when this image appeared on her screen one morning in 2024, she stopped mid-sip of coffee. She was working through a batch of newly digitized photos from the Boston Historical Society, a huge collection that had been stored away for years. This picture was labeled simply as a family portrait taken at a Boston studio in 1908. It showed a mother in her mid-30s wearing a dark, high-necked dress with lace. Her hair was styled in the popular Gibson girl look. Her 3 daughters stood around her in neat white dresses with large ribbons. The children looked to be around 6, 9, and 12 years old. Behind them was a painted backdrop of pillars and draped cloth, the usual setup for that time period. The scene looked peaceful and proper, but something felt off. Helen zoomed in and studied their expressions. The mother looked straight at the camera with a stiff, controlled face. The 2 older girls also faced forward with small, careful smiles. Only the youngest girl was turned away. Her head was sharply angled to the left, her eyes wide and fixed on something outside the frame. Her expression was not boredom or distraction. It was fear, real fear. Helen felt a chill. She had viewed thousands of old portraits, many with restless kids. But this child's look was different. Even in the faded tones, the fear was clear. She leaned closer and noticed the mother's hand on the youngest girl's shoulder. The fingers seemed to grip so tightly that they pressed deep wrinkles into the girl's dress. Helen saved the photograph and marked it for closer study. Her instincts told her something important was hidden in this image. She spent the next morning searching for documents related to the photo. The archives were large but often incomplete because of lost records over the years. She started by checking which photography studios were active in Boston in 1908. The painted backdrop looked familiar, and after comparing it with other examples, she identified it as the work of Whitfield and Sons, a well-known studio on Tremont Street. The Historical Society owned part of the studio's old records. 3 boxes of studio ledgers and papers were delivered to her desk. In one ledger from 1908, she found the entry she needed, March 14, 1908. Mrs. Catherine Harrison and daughters. Family portrait sitting. Full payment received. Now she had a name. Next, she searched through the studio correspondence and found something unexpected. A letter dated March 20th, 1908, written by an assistant photographer named J. Foster. He wrote that he needed to speak with the studio owner about concerns regarding the Harrison photo session. His note was clipped to a short reply stating the matter had been discussed and resolved. The wording left Helen uneasy. What had the assistant seen? And why was it dismissed so quickly? Helen moved on to public records. She searched for a woman named Catherine Harrison with 3 daughters living in Boston in 1908. One match stood out, a family living at 287 Beacon Street, a prestigious address at the time. The household included Catherine, age 34, and her husband, Dr. William Harrison, a 42-year-old physician. Dr. Harrison had graduated from Harvard Medical School and built a successful career treating upper-class patients, focusing on what were then called nervous disorders in women. Newspapers often described him as a respected community figure. Catherine came from a wealthy local family, and the couple had 3 daughters: Margaret, born in 1896, Dorothy, born in 1899, and Clara, born in 1902. On paper, the Harrisons seemed like an admired and comfortable family. But Helen knew that families from that era sometimes had serious problems behind polished appearances. She looked deeper into newspaper archives and found an unusual article from April 1907. Dr. Harrison had testified in a case involving a woman accused of trying to harm herself. He claimed her nervous hysteria made her unstable and dangerous, and he recommended institutional care. Articles showed he had given similar testimony in multiple cases. Reading this now, while thinking about the frightened child in the photograph, made Helen uneasy. Something wasn't adding up. Helen kept returning to the assistant photographer, J. Foster. She searched for him in employment records and found he worked at Whitfield and Sons between 1906 and 1909. After that, his name disappeared from local records until she found him listed in Canada in 1913. Unsure where else to look, Helen posted a request on genealogy forums. 3 days later, she received a message from a woman named Patricia Ellis in Toronto who said Jay Foster was her great-grandfather. They arranged a video call. Patricia held a small leather journal and explained that Jay had kept detailed diaries. She had searched them for the name Harrison and found an entry from March 14th, 1908, the day of the portrait sitting. She read the entry aloud. Jay wrote that the father came with the family and stayed in the studio during the session. The youngest girl kept watching her father with such fear that Jay struggled to focus on his work. When he suggested the father wait outside, the man refused. Jay also wrote that the mother's hand shook the entire time and that the youngest child never once looked toward the camera. Then Patricia showed Helen something even more startling, a small note her great-grandfather had saved. Jay wrote that after the family left, he found a slip of paper tucked behind a curtain where the mother had stood. It said, "Help us." Jay had taken the note to the studio owner, but the owner refused to intervene. He insisted they were just photographers and that Dr. Harrison, being a respected doctor, could judge his own family situation. Jay kept the note anyway and tried to help. Patricia then read another diary entry. A week after the photo session, Jay went to the Harrison home pretending to deliver extra copies of Portrait. He hoped to speak with Catherine privately, but the housekeeper told him she was indisposed. As he left, he saw the oldest daughter watching from an upstairs window. Even from a distance, he could see bruises on her face. Helen listened, shaken. This was no longer about one child's frightened expression. Something was happening to the entire family. Patricia continued. Jay went to police, but the officers dismissed his concerns, saying Dr. Harrison was a respected man. At that time, women had no voting rights, and laws protecting women and children from domestic harm barely existed. Families often had few options for help. Patricia turned to one final diary entry from June 1908. It described how Catherine had tried to leave with her daughters, planning to take a train to New York and stay with her sister. But they were stopped at the station. Dr. Harrison arrived with a police officer and claimed Catherine was having a severe breakdown and attempting to take the children in a confused state. The officer accepted his explanation, and the family was forced to return home. Jay wrote that he saw them being led away. Catherine's face looked empty, as if she had given up. The youngest daughter was crying. Dr. Harrison appeared calm. Jay tried again to report what he knew, but police warned him he could face trouble for accusing a respected doctor. He wrote that he became afraid for his job and safety. Helen understood why Joseph Foster had struggled. He had been a young assistant with little influence trying to raise concerns about a well-known Boston doctor. The system of the time was built to protect men like William Harrison and dismiss anyone who questioned them. Is that the last mention of the family? Helen asked. Almost, Patricia said. She lifted a newspaper clipping kept in a plastic sleeve. My great-grandfather saved this. It was dated July 15, 1908. The headline announced that the wife of a respected Boston doctor had been sent to Danvers State Hospital for severe nervous breakdown. Patricia read the short article. It said that Catherine Harrison had been admitted for hysteria and melancholia, and that Dr. Harrison expressed sorrow over her condition. Their 3 daughters, the paper noted, were staying with relatives. Helen pressed her hands together. He had been able to have her committed with nothing more than his signature. Patricia nodded. At that time, husbands could make that decision without any outside review. Helen set out to learn what happened to Catherine after she was taken to Danvers, a hospital known for harsh conditions despite being considered modern when it first opened. She contacted the state archives. After filling out the needed paperwork, she received digital copies of Catherine's records 3 weeks later. The file was brief and clinical. It listed Catherine as 34 years old when admitted on July 12, 1908. Her diagnosis matched the wording from the newspaper. The notes describe her as irrational, accusing her husband of mistreatment, and attempting to flee with the children. The account seemed based entirely on information provided by Dr. Harrison. There was no sign that Catherine had been allowed to speak for herself. The treatment notes were difficult to read. Catherine had been put through common procedures of the era, including ice baths, long periods of forced rest, tube feeding, and isolation whenever she asked about her daughters. One nurse wrote in August 1908 that Catherine insisted she was not sick and begged daily to see her children. By October, she had been moved to a more secure wing. By early 1909, notes describe her as quiet, withdrawn, and resigned. The hospital had worn her down. Then Helen found a small detail that stood out. A nurse wrote in March 1909 that Catherine's sister, Alice Lowe, had visited for the first time in months. Catherine showed emotion. After the visit, she asked for writing materials, but the request was denied on her husband's orders. Helen looked for information on Alice and found that she was unmarried, financially independent, and active in early women's rights groups. If anyone had fought for Catherine, it would have been her. At the archives of a local suffrage organization, Helen found what she hoped for: letters written by Alice throughout 1909 and 1910. In them, Alice pleaded with lawyers and activists for help freeing her sister. She explained that Catherine was clear-minded and had been committed only because she tried to keep her children safe. Every lawyer gave the same answer. There was no process to challenge a husband's decision. Alice reached out to leaders in the women's movement. She argued that cases like Catherine showed exactly why women needed legal rights. She kept pressing, even hiring a private investigator to collect information about William Harrison. The 1909 investigators' report showed troubling behavior from Dr. Harrison, including drinking, violent outbursts, and a maid statement that she had seen him strike his daughters. Alice brought the report to Danvers administrators, but they dismissed it and claimed Catherine's belief in the evidence proved she was unstable. Alice found one ally, Dr. Margaret Cleves, who examined Catherine and reported no sign of mental illness, only trauma. She wrote that Catherine's commitment was a misuse of medical authority, but officials rejected her findings. Helen then traced the daughters' lives. In 1910, they still lived with their father. By 1920, Margaret remained in Boston. Dorothy had moved to New York, and Clara was living in staff housing at Danvers, arranged by Alice, so she could stay near her mother. Clara later wrote that living there helped her understand the truth. She became active in reform efforts and, in 1923, testified before lawmakers with the 1908 photograph in hand. A new law requiring independent evaluations soon passed. Catherine was released in 1924. Alice, Clara, and Dorothy reunited with her. Decades later, Helen showed the photograph to Clara's grandchildren, who donated it to a 2025 exhibit. Visitors saw it not as a simple portrait, but as long overlooked evidence finally recognized.